We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
This speech heavily contributed to the space race and the ideals for which it was fought. Following World War II, aeronautics as a science began to emerge across the globe. The US military originally designed classified experiments about space under the umbrella of the Air Force, with Soviet scientists doing the same. Eventually, after the founding of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration in 1958, space became a non-violent area of nationalism and patriotism for the two nuclear superpowers. Over time, space shuttles in the late 20th century became the forefront of both the scientific and political frontier, as they served as weapons of nationalism and technological advancement of America and the USSR. World War I and World War II were marked by the development of aircraft, pushing the frontiers of travel and combat further. With the establishment of the Air Force, space exploration slowly expanded as a focus of the global superpowers, namely the US and the USSR. By their own words, when NASA opened for business on October 1st, 1958, it accelerated the work that already had started on human and robotic spaceflight. NASA's first high-profile program was Project Mercury, an effort to learn if humans could survive in space. Following the success of NASA's early missions, such as Project Mercury, as well as competition with the Soviets, NASA had a number of other successful missions of the 20th century, namely the Apollo project, which landed humans on the moon, the Skylab project, which put a functional, scientific, manned lab into orbit, and the Apollo-Soyuz, which broadcast the handshake in space across the world, and of course the Shuttle program, which lasted for 30 years, carried 355 people to space, and collectively flew 135 missions. On January 5, 1972, President Nixon ordered NASA and the Air Force to begin developing a reusable, multi-function spaceplane with a program name Dinosaur. The shuttles would be designed to transport vehicles to space, service a large orbiting space station, transport to a manned lunar colony, and for a mission to bring humans to Mars. The design that was finally decided was a central orbiting ship, the shuttle or plane part as the anchor, two side-mounted reusable solid fuel boosters, and a large external tank. After launch, the pieces would fall into the ocean to be reused or retired. The initial proposal became known as NASA Document 331, the Space Shuttle. Following Nixon's speech, NASA began searching for a main contractor to start building the shuttles. The firm they chose was the North American Rockwell Corporation. Construction for the first shuttle began on June 4, 1974, in Downey, California. The unofficial name for the shuttle was OV-101, or Orbital Vehicle 101, with plans on making the official name the Constitution. This being the first shuttle ever built, it was designed for ground testing and in-atmospheric flight, not for space capabilities. Closer to the early launch date, there was a mass write-in campaign to rename the ship Enterprise, after the ship from the popular sci-fi show Star Trek. In June of 1977, they began their first manned test flight, and on August 12th, the Enterprise made its maiden solo flight. By October, they had completed 4 other approach and landing tests. During the month of March 1978, the shuttle was flown to Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, where it was mated with an inactive rocket booster, aka solid rocket booster, or SRB. Enterprise, on top of the Space Carrier Shuttle, was then flown to the Kennedy Space Center, NASA's main spaceport located on Merritt Island, Florida, near Cape Canaveral and Satellite Beach, where NASA does many of its launches. NASA then connected the shuttle with the large external tank as well as the solid rocket boosters mounted on the sides. On May 1st, the Enterprise, with its boosters and tank, was rolled out to Launch Pad 39A, where it stayed for 3 months, doing tests and experiments to prepare for the first functional real shuttle, Columbia. On July 25th, Enterprise was separated from the external tank and remained on the shuttle landing facility until the SCA, or Space Carrier Shuttle, arrived. They then flew back to Dryden, California, to the construction facility from August 10th to August 16th, making a total of 6 stops on their journey with a combined 750,000 people viewing the orbiter and the plane. Largely completing its task as a prototype test vehicle, the Enterprise would continue to be used for testing and public appearances until 2003, when it was originally put into the hangar of the Udgar Hazy Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. When the program was officially retired in 2011, the shuttles were donated to many museums across the country. The Intrepid Air and Space Museum in New York City acquired the Enterprise, the Intrepid being a large aircraft carrier, and to this day, Enterprise remains there. After the success and fame of the Enterprise, NASA began preparing to launch the first functional shuttle, the Columbia. Exactly 20 years after the flight of Yuri Gagarin on April 12, 1981, Flight Commanders John Young and Robert Crippen lay in wait on the launch. This new launch day was due to a computer glitch, but it ended up coinciding with the anniversary of the Russian launch perfectly. The original launch day, set for 2 days prior, the 10th, the engineers had to refill the external tank with liquid hydrogen and oxygen. after which Young and Crippen were awoken, given a short physical exam, had breakfast, and were shuttled to the launch pad. They took the elevators up and assumed pilot chairs of the STS-1. This launch was not only unprecedented, doing it to being the first shuttle, but never before had a rocket's first test be manned. A combined 600,000 spectators watched from nearby Florida beaches, intent on watching the first functional shuttle take to the sky. That day, April 12, 1981, at 7 a.m. sharp, the engines ignited, with 121 milliseconds of each other, followed shortly after by the side-mounted rocket boosters, propelling the 4.5 million-pound vehicle with 6.8 million pounds of thrust. They landed without a hitch, becoming an incredibly successful first flight of the Space Shuttle program. After the success of STS-1, Columbia became the workhorse of space science and transport across the world. Columbia's ninth mission was the transport of Spacelab. Spacelab was Europe's first space station, a modern version of NASA's Skylab. Spacelab was a small space station that was used for numerous missions and tests for space travel and set the groundwork for the International Space Station. STS-9 launched in November of 1983. The lab was housed inside Columbia's cargo bay for the first mission and its last mission in 1998. One of Columbia's later missions is still in effect today. That is the launch of the Chandra X-ray Observatory, which Columbia carried into space on July 23rd of 1999 on STS-93. On January 16, 2003, Columbia launched what became its final mission. The mission, dubbed STS-107, was a flight dedicated to experimentation requiring limited gravity. Soon after launch, a piece of foam insulation broke away from the external tank, hitting the edge of the left delta wing 81 seconds later.
My fellow Americans, this day has brought terrible news and great sadness to our country. At 9 o'clock this morning, Mission Control in Houston lost contact with our Space Shuttle Columbia. A short time later, debris was seen falling from the skies above Texas. The Columbia is lost. There are no survivors. On board was a crew of 7. Colonel Rick Husband, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Anderson, Commander Laurel Clark, Captain David Brown, Commander William McCool, Dr. Kulpna Shavla, and Ilan Ramon, a colonel in the Israeli Air Force.
The first mission of the year was a Challenger flight. The plan of the mission was to have Teacher in Space broadcasts, launch a tracking and data relay satellite, as well as the Spartan Haley Comet Observatory. The crew included a mix of experienced astronauts and rookies, one of whom was a school teacher and a private citizen. At 11:38 a.m., Challenger lifted off. The smoke and plume of a flame became noticeable 59 seconds after launch. 13 seconds later, the fire loosened the connection between the external tank and the booster, recording Sir Pilot Michael Smith saying, "Uh-oh." 1 second later, the much-loosened booster collided with the external fuel tank, igniting more than 500,000 pounds of hydrogen and oxygen. The resulting explosion destroyed the ship and killed all 7 crew members. This marked the worst disaster of all manned flights and the first time that astronauts died during a mission. This horrific catastrophe was viewed all across the nation and the world. Following the disaster, President Reagan designated an independent commission to investigate, the Rogers Commission. Throughout its lifespan, the shuttle program consistently pushed the boundaries and achievements of the political, scientific, and space frontiers. Politically, the shuttles are symbols of national pride and success between Russia and the US. By competing on a technological and scientific front, the sense of political competition was positive and non-destructive, a new frontier of warfare. This competition became a collaboration, such as with the earlier Apollo-Soyuz missions and especially with the partnership between the Soviet Mir station and the shuttles that would service, transport, and further development, Atlantis, Endeavour, and Discovery. Scientifically, the shuttle program pushed the frontiers of science leagues ahead by providing a whole new way to do tests and experiments under microgravity with non-atmospheric ray exposure and the ability to launch extremely complex satellites. On the space front, the shuttle program completely ratified the frontier as a whole. The program transported more people to space and made more missions and launched more spacecraft than any other, and began the idea of reusable spacecraft. The satellites launched by the shuttle program, Chandra, Hubble, Galileo, Magellan, etc., have helped us understand not just the complexities of space as a whole, but also how the ever-encompassing universe was formed.